I never thought I'd be the kind of man who gets fooled. 38 years running operations for one of the largest oil companies in Texas will make you believe you can read people. You sit across boardroom tables from men who want to take everything you have, and you learn to see it coming. You develop instincts. You trust those instincts with your life. And then you fly 12,000 miles from Houston to a little island in the Philippines, and a woman with a quiet smile and a resort manager's uniform dismantles every single one of those instincts in 6 months flat. $540,000. Gone. I'm sitting here in my kitchen back in San Antonio, and I still can't fully explain how it happened. Not because I don't understand it now, I do, completely, painfully, but because understanding it doesn't make it hurt any less. It just makes me realize how carefully I was chosen, how precisely I was taken apart, and how long they must have been doing this before I ever walked off that plane. It started because I was tired. That's the honest truth, and I think that's what they counted on. I'd spent 4 decades building something, a career, a reputation, a financial position that most men would have been grateful for. I retired at 66 with more money than I'd ever expected to see, a house in San Antonio that felt too large for one man, and a quiet that I didn't know what to do with. My wife Linda had passed 3 years before, breast cancer. Fast and cruel, the way those things usually are. We'd been married 31 years. After she was gone, I tried to fill the space with work, with my adult son back in Dallas, with golf twice a week and church on Sundays. None of it reached me. I was present in my life, but not inside it. Does that make sense? I was just going through motions in a house full of memories that no longer had anyone to share them with. My doctor told me I needed to rest. My accountant told me I needed to diversify my assets. My son told me I needed to travel. I listened to my son. He'd been talking about Southeast Asia for years, said it was cheap, beautiful, warm, and that the people were some of the friendliest he'd ever encountered on any of his business trips. He recommended the Philippines specifically. Said Boracay was unlike anywhere else he'd been. White sand, turquoise water, warm evenings, good food. Just go for 2 weeks, Dad, he said. You don't have to fall in love with it. Just breathe somewhere new. So in early January, I booked a suite at a resort in Boracay, the kind of place that costs more than most people's monthly salary but felt justified when you looked at the photos online. I told myself it was a recovery trip. Grief recovery. 2 weeks. Then home. I remember stepping off the small propeller plane from Manila and feeling the heat hit me before I even reached the tarmac. It was different from Texas heat, softer somehow, damp and warm in a way that felt like the air was wrapping around you rather than punishing you. The drive to the resort took 20 minutes, and I sat in the back of the van watching the road and the coconut trees and the slow pace of everyone moving through their day, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like time had slowed down, like there was permission to just exist without producing anything. I thought maybe my son was right. I thought maybe this was exactly what I needed. Sheila Montano met me at the front desk of the resort. She was in her late 30s. I guess, though, she looked younger, with the kind of calm confidence that comes from managing a place well and knowing it. She wore a light blue uniform, had her dark hair pulled back neatly, and she spoke English with the slight musical lilt that Filipinos have when they're comfortable with the language. She introduced herself as the resort manager and personally showed me to my suite. I noticed she was thorough. She explained every amenity, asked about my preferences, noted that I was traveling alone, and made sure I had her personal number in case I needed anything. I didn't think anything of it. That's what good hospitality looks like. That's what you're paying for at a place like that. I thanked her and tipped her well, which I later learned was the first piece of information she collected about me. How freely I spent, how casually I handed money over without keeping track. One small interaction, and she already knew something important. The first 3 days were genuinely peaceful. I ate fresh seafood on the beach. I walked along the water at sunset. I read 2 books I hadn't had time for in years. I didn't check my email once. On the 4th evening, Sheila stopped by my table at the resort's outdoor restaurant, not intrusively, just warmly, the way a good host checks on a guest. She asked how I was settling in. I told her I was impressed by the island, more than I expected. She smiled and said there was a side of Boracay that most tourists never saw: the real community, the local businesses, the people who'd built their lives there. She said if I was interested, she'd be happy to show me around sometime. I said yes without hesitating. I was lonely. I wanted company. I wanted to feel connected to a place, rather than just passing through it. She offered exactly that, and I reached for it. We spent the following 2 evenings together, first a walk through a quieter part of the island where local families lived, then dinner at a small restaurant away from the tourist strip where she seemed to know everyone. She introduced me to people warmly, explained who they were, gave context to the community. She was good at making me feel included, like I was being let in on something rather than sold something. She talked about her own life, how she'd grown up poor in a small town in the Visayas, how she'd worked her way up through hospitality, how managing the resort had taken years of effort and sacrifice. She was proud of herself, and that came through clearly. I respected it. I also found her company easy and warm, and when I went back to my suite in those evenings, I noticed I was looking forward to the next day in a way I hadn't in years. I told myself it was the island. I told myself it was simply the relief of not being alone. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was the whole truth. By the end of my first week, Sheila mentioned that a small gathering was happening at a friend's home. A group of local professionals and international residents who met regularly to talk business, community development, and investment opportunities in the island's growing hospitality sector. She said it wasn't formal, just good people having dinner and conversation. She thought I might find it interesting, given my background in business. She knew about my background because I'd told her. Over those dinners, I'd been open about my career, my retirement, my financial position, in the general way that men sometimes do when they're trying to establish who they are in a new setting. I mentioned oil. I mentioned executive roles. I mentioned that I was financially secure and in no hurry to go back to work. Every word was useful to her. I understand that now. At the time, I thought I was just making conversation with someone I was beginning to trust. I went to the gathering. The house was large and well-appointed, not ostentatious, but clearly the home of someone with money and taste. There were 12 or 13 people there. Sheila introduced me around. There was a man named Rodrigo, who she described as a real estate developer with several beachfront properties under development. There was a woman named Bernadette, supposedly a consultant for international hospitality investment. There was a man called Vic, who spoke with an Australian accent and said he'd been living in the Philippines for 7 years and had more money in this island than he'd ever made back home. There were others, each one with a specific identity, a specific area of expertise, and a specific warmth that felt genuine in the moment. Everyone was friendly. Everyone seemed successful. Everyone seemed to know Sheila well and to respect her. I sat in that living room eating well and drinking good wine and thinking that this was the kind of evening I hadn't had since Linda died. Real company. Interesting people. Purpose in the room. The conversations turned to real estate fairly naturally, or what felt natural at the time. Rodrigo mentioned that Boracay's development restrictions had recently been loosened in certain zones, creating rare opportunities for beachfront investment that hadn't existed in years. He said the local government was actively encouraging qualified foreign investors with residency ties. Sheila nodded along. Bernadette offered statistics about returns on hospitality investment in the region. Vic talked about a property he'd acquired 2 years earlier that had already tripled in value. Nobody pitched me directly. Nobody handed me a brochure or gave me a hard sell. The conversation just flowed in a direction that made investment seem obvious, logical, and overdue. I asked questions. They answered smoothly, credibly, with detail. I walked back to my resort that night thinking about what Rodrigo had said about a specific beachfront parcel that was, according to him, available for a limited time. I should have called my accountant. I should have called my son. I should have asked for documentation, legal review, a title search. I did none of those things. I told myself I was an experienced businessman who could evaluate an opportunity without holding someone's hand. I had 38 years of making large decisions under pressure. I thought I was operating from experience. I was operating from loneliness and flattery and a need to feel relevant in a life that had started to feel purposeless. Within 10 days of that first gathering, I handed Rodrigo a wire transfer of $95,000 for what he described as a partial stake in a beachfront development opportunity on the northern end of the island. Sheila was present when the agreement was signed. She smiled and told me I'd made a smart decision. I believed her. I extended my stay by another 3 weeks. Month 2 is where the numbers began to accelerate in ways I didn't fully register at the time. Rodrigo introduced me to a man named Ferdy, who managed what he called a resort partnership program, a model where outside investors could buy into an existing resort's expansion phase and receive a percentage of annual revenue once operations scaled. Ferdy was smooth, precise, and patient with my questions. He showed me a portfolio of what appeared to be architectural renderings, financial projections, and a letter of intent from a regional banking institution. Everything looked legitimate. Sheila vouched for him the way she'd vouched for everyone, quietly, confidently, without pressure. I transferred $140,000 to an account Ferdy provided. I told myself I was diversifying. I told myself this was exactly what my accountant had recommended, getting my money out of stagnant accounts and into growing assets. The fact that I was doing it in a foreign country on the advice of people I'd known for less than 60 days didn't register as clearly as it should have. What I remember from those weeks is how complete the social world felt. There were more dinners, more gatherings. New people were introduced gradually, always through someone I already knew, always with credentials that sounded right. There was a retired Philippine general who apparently had connections in the regional land authority. There was a woman named Cora who claimed to work with an international real estate firm with offices in Singapore and Hong Kong. Each person confirmed what the others had said. Each new conversation reinforced the credibility of the previous one. It was like a web, interconnected, self-supporting, designed to make doubt feel foolish. Looking back, I can see exactly how it worked, but you don't see a web when you're in the middle of it. You just feel held. Sheila's role during all of this was quiet and central. She never demanded anything. She never pushed. She just stayed close, attentive, warm, always present at the right moment. She'd check on me in the mornings. She'd arrange excursions to different parts of the island. She'd sit across from me over dinner and ask how I was sleeping, how I was feeling, whether I missed Texas. She made me feel seen in a way I hadn't since Linda died. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds, and I'm not proud of it, but I need to be honest about it because that's the part that made everything else possible. A man who is lonely and grieving and far from home is not thinking about wire transfers and title deeds. He's thinking about how good it feels to have someone ask how he slept. That's what Sheila understood. That's what she used. By the time I'd been there 3 months, my extended stay had become something else entirely. I wasn't a tourist anymore. I was embedded. I had a network of people who called me by name, who invited me to things, who treated me like a member of their community. I had financial commitments on the island that I told myself made it responsible to stay and monitor. I'd spoken to my son twice during this period, brief calls, where I told him I was enjoying myself and had found some interesting investment opportunities. He asked the right questions. I gave him reassuring non-answers and changed the subject. I didn't want to be talked out of it. I'd already started to sense, somewhere in the back of my mind, that something wasn't adding up, but I pushed that sense down because I didn't want to lose what I thought I had found. The 4th month was when Sheila began presenting what she called urgent windows. A parcel of land near the resort that was about to be purchased by a competing developer but could be mine if I moved quickly. A hospitality license that was being offered at a reduced rate because the original applicant had backed out. A resort renovation partnership that would guarantee me a suite at no cost for life if I contributed to the development fund. Each one came with a deadline. Each one came with the implication that hesitation meant loss. I know now that these deadlines were manufactured, that the competing developers didn't exist, that the licenses and partnerships were fabrications. In the moment, they felt like the kind of time-sensitive opportunities that experienced businessmen act on, so I acted. $185,000 across 3 separate transfers in month 4 alone. I watched the numbers move out of my accounts and told myself they were moving into something real. My son called at the end of that month. He'd been speaking to my accountant, who had flagged unusual activity in my accounts. My son asked me directly what was happening with my money. I told him I was making investments. He asked me to describe them. I tried, and as I heard myself speaking, I felt for the first time how thin the descriptions sounded. Beachfront parcels with no addresses. Resort partnerships with no registered entities. A development fund with no corporate documentation that I could put in his hands. My son's silence on the other end of that call was harder to sit with than anything Sheila had ever said to me. He asked me to come home. I told him I needed more time. He said I was scared to admit I'd made a mistake. I said I wasn't scared of anything. I hung up and sat on my balcony for a long time, watching the water. Then I went and had dinner with Sheila and told myself my son didn't understand the opportunity. Month 5 is when the cracks became visible in ways I could no longer ignore. I asked Rodrigo for updated documentation on the beachfront development title, confirmation, a construction timeline, any evidence that the project had moved forward since I'd invested. He gave me a long explanation about regulatory delays and asked for patience. I asked Ferdy for a status report on the resort partnership. He sent a document that, when I read it carefully, said almost nothing specific about anything. I asked Bernadette to put me in contact with the Singapore office of the firm she supposedly represented. She said she would arrange it. She never did. I went back to Sheila and told her I was concerned. She sat across from me in her calm, unruffled way and told me that delays were normal in Philippine real estate, that I needed to trust the process, that she wouldn't have introduced me to these people if she didn't believe in them completely. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Preston," she said, "these people respect you. Don't insult them by doubting them now." That sentence worked on me for 3 more weeks. I am ashamed to say it, but it did. The truth came in 2 pieces, the way painful truths often do. The first piece arrived when I hired a local lawyer, not through any of Sheila's contacts, but through the hotel concierge of a different resort, where I went one afternoon just to walk somewhere unfamiliar. The lawyer, a quiet woman named Attorney Ferrer, agreed to run searches on the properties and entities I described. She called me 2 days later and told me what she'd found. The beachfront parcels didn't exist under the titles I'd been given. The resort partnership entity was registered to an address that turned out to be an empty lot. The development fund was a personal account. None of it was real. Not one piece of what I'd spent 4 months building in my mind had any legal existence. I sat in her office in Kalibo, and I didn't say anything for a very long time. I heard the words. I understood the words. My body just didn't know how to respond to them yet. The second piece came when I drove back to the resort and walked directly to Sheila's office. She was there. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw something shift in her face, small, fast, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She'd been doing this long enough to recognize the moment when a man has found out the truth. She didn't panic. She composed herself immediately and asked what was wrong. I told her what Attorney Ferrer had said. I laid it out plainly and clearly. Sheila sat back in her chair and said the lawyer must be mistaken, that these things were complicated, that documents could look different depending on how they were filed. She stayed calm throughout, steady, practiced. She told me not to make any decisions while I was upset. She told me to sleep on it. She told me she would make calls in the morning and get everything sorted. That was the last real conversation I had with her. The next morning, her office was empty. A young man at the front desk told me that Sheila was on leave for personal reasons and hadn't specified when she'd return. Her cell phone went straight to voicemail. It still does. Rodrigo was gone too. Ferdy stopped answering. Bernadette's phone was disconnected. The man who'd introduced himself as the retired general had apparently checked out of the villa he'd been renting 2 days earlier. The woman named Cora hadn't existed under any professional registration that Attorney Ferrer could find. Within 72 hours of my conversation with Sheila, the entire network simply dissolved. Like it had never existed, like I had dreamed all of it, but I hadn't dreamed the wire confirmations. I hadn't dreamed the account numbers. I hadn't dreamed the $540,000 that was no longer in my accounts. That part was very, very real. I want to be clear about what the following days felt like, because I think it matters. People assume that when a man realizes he's been robbed, the dominant emotion is rage. And there was rage, quiet, cold, coursing through me at 3 in the morning when I'd go over every detail in my head looking for the exact moment I should have stopped. But what I felt more than rage was a specific kind of shame that I'd never experienced before in my life. I'd built a career on judgment. I'd made decisions that affected hundreds of millions of dollars of corporate assets. I'd hired and fired executives, negotiated contracts across 4 continents, walked away from deals that didn't smell right. And here in this small island, a woman in a resort uniform had seen through all of that in about 15 minutes and understood precisely how to reach the part of me that was vulnerable. She hadn't attacked my intelligence. She'd bypassed it. She'd found the grief, the loneliness, the 68-year-old man who missed his wife and wanted to feel alive again, and she'd worked with that. Quietly and completely, for 6 months. That's what made me sick. Not just the money, the precision of it. I had $8,000 left in the account I used for daily expenses. Everything else was gone. I filed a report with the local police. I filed a report with the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation. I contacted the U.S. Embassy in Manila, who were helpful and compassionate and honest enough to tell me that recovery in cases like this was rare and slow. I contacted an international financial fraud attorney who told me the same thing in different words and charged me $3,000 for the conversation. I put the plane ticket home on a credit card. I called my son from the airport in Manila, and when he answered, I didn't say anything right away. He knew. He just said, "Dad, come home." And I did. My son met me at San Antonio Airport. He didn't say anything about what had happened, not right away. He just took my bag and drove me to his house in Dallas and made sure I ate something and slept. In the weeks that followed, as I began putting the full picture together working with attorney Ferrer remotely, gathering what documentation I had, tracing the wire transfers through my bank's fraud department, he was present for all of it, without making me feel worse than I already did. What he did eventually say, quietly, one evening over coffee, was this: "Dad, they didn't beat you because you were stupid. They beat you because you were hurting, and you were alone, and they knew how to use that." I didn't respond because there was nothing to add to it. It was exactly right. The investigation confirmed what attorney Ferrer had first uncovered. The operation was coordinated, not improvised. Sheila had been the central node of a network that had been running versions of this scheme across at least 3 other islands for several years. The gatherings, the introductions, the layered vouching system, the manufactured urgency, all of it was structured and rehearsed. Rodrigo wasn't a real estate developer. Ferdy wasn't a hospitality consultant. Vic, the Australian who'd told me about his property tripling in value, was a paid participant who appeared at these gatherings to give the scheme international credibility from someone who looked like me. All of it. Every warm handshake and dinner conversation and credibility-confirming story had been constructed specifically to work on men like me, retired, wealthy, lonely, far from home. The Philippine National Bureau of Investigation made 2 arrests related to the broader network about 4 months after my report was filed. Neither arrest was Sheila. She had left the island before I'd finished my conversation at the resort. She was, as far as anyone could tell, operating under a different name in a different location. Whether she was still doing what she'd done to me, I didn't know. I tried not to think about it too much because there was nothing I could do about it, and because letting it live in my head was its own kind of theft. I reported everything I knew. I cooperated fully. Then I tried to release my grip on the outcome, because holding on to it was going to cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. I've thought a lot about what I was really chasing when I booked that trip. I told myself it was rest. I told myself it was a change of scenery, a chance to breathe, a 2-week break from a quiet life that had grown too quiet. But when I'm truly honest with myself, I know it was more than that. I was chasing something Linda's death had taken from me, the feeling of being chosen by someone, of mattering to a specific person who was glad you were there. I'd had that for 31 years, and then I didn't have it, and the absence of it had become a weight that no amount of money or square footage or Sunday church attendance could lighten. Sheila felt that weight on me immediately. She was skilled enough to offer exactly what was missing, just real enough to be convincing, just warm enough to bypass everything I thought I knew about people. And I let her, because I wanted what she was offering more than I wanted to be careful. That's the part that no one tells you about grief. It doesn't make you dumb, it makes you hungry. Hungry for connection, for warmth, for the feeling that the world is still a place where something good might happen to you. That hunger is legitimate and human, and it doesn't go away because you're 68, or because you've had a successful career, or because you know better. And men like me, men with money and loneliness, and the particular kind of pride that comes from decades of success, are exactly the men that operations like this are built to find. I wasn't an unusual victim. I was a typical one. That took me a long time to fully accept. There are practical things I've done since coming home. I've restructured my accounts in ways that make large wire transfers require additional verification steps and a 48-hour cooling period. I've given my son financial power of attorney over amounts above a certain threshold, which was a conversation that cost me a great deal of pride but was the right thing to do. I've spoken to a therapist, a grief counselor specifically, which is what I probably should have done 2 years ago instead of flying to the Philippines. She's helped me understand that what happened in Boracay wasn't a business failure. It was a grief story. The money was almost incidental. What I was really paying for was the illusion of belonging, of being chosen. That understanding doesn't make $540,000 reappear, but it does mean something. What I haven't done is stop living. I still go to church on Sundays. I still play golf twice a week. My son and his family visit more often now. I think the whole experience frightened him in a way that brought him closer. My granddaughter came to stay with me for a week in the spring, and we watched movies every night, and she taught me how to use a new phone, and we ate too much ice cream. And there were entire evenings where I didn't think about Boracay at all. Those evenings felt like something returning. I don't know what to call it exactly. Maybe just the quiet willingness to still be here, still in the middle of things, still capable of an evening that matters. I'll take that. I'm not angry at the Philippines. I want to be clear about that. The people I met there, the ones who weren't running a scheme, were warm and genuine and real. Attorney Ferrer, who worked quickly and honestly and charged me a fair rate and looked genuinely troubled when she delivered her findings. The young man at the airport information desk who helped me find the right terminal when I was too distracted to think straight. The woman who ran the small restaurant near Rodrigo's fake development site, who made the best grilled fish I've ever eaten in my life and who knew nothing about any of it. The country isn't what happened to me. A network of calculated, practiced thieves who happened to operate on a beautiful island is what happened to me. There's a difference, and I think it matters. What I want, if I'm being fully honest about why I'm telling this story, is for another man somewhere to hear it and recognize something. Maybe he's sitting in a hotel room in Boracay or Cebu or somewhere else, beautiful and foreign, and a woman has been very kind to him, and he's been introduced to some interesting people, and someone has mentioned an investment opportunity, and it all feels real and warm and exactly what he needed. Maybe he's lonely. Maybe he's grieving. Maybe he's 65 or 70, and he thought the best chapters of his life were behind him, and this place suddenly feels like a second chance. I want him to hear this, not to scare him off, not to poison everything with suspicion, but to say, go slowly, call your son, call your accountant, wait 48 hours before any financial decision. Let the warmth be real, but let the business be verified. Because the warmth and the business are not the same thing, and the people who understand that distinction better than you ever will are the ones you should be most careful of. 6 months. $540,000. A resort manager named Sheila who understood loneliness better than I understood my own loneliness. That's the story. I can't get the money back. I've accepted that. What I refuse to give back is whatever's left of the man. I am flawed, foolish in ways I didn't expect. Still here, still learning. still occasionally eating too much ice cream with his granddaughter on a warm Texas night. That much I'm keeping.